The United States has been borrowing for over 2 centuries. From the very birth of the nation, debt was never seen as a burden but as a tool. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress issued paper money backed by little more than hope. The experiment failed. Hyperinflation swept across the colonies, leaving the fledgling economy in ruins and forcing a hard lesson on the young country. Borrowing without credibility is fatal. Alexander Hamilton learned from that failure. He introduced Treasury bonds, turning debt into a formalized instrument of trust. Foreign investors, private banks, and eventually ordinary citizens bought these government promises. The U.S. realized that power lies not in printing money, but in convincing others to fund it. As the nation expanded westward and industrialized, this model evolved. Railroads were constructed on borrowed funds, factories were financed by bonds, wars were funded with government debt, and economic crises were stabilized through borrowing. By the mid-20th century, the United States was no longer merely a debtor nation. It had become the epicenter of global finance. Debt became the engine of growth, creating a feedback loop. Borrow, spend, grow, borrow more. Each cycle made the country wealthier, stronger, and more indispensable to the world. The global gold standard once imposed a constraint, promising that every dollar could be exchanged for gold. It was a pact of trust that tethered government finance to something tangible. But the 1960s tested that trust to the limit. The Vietnam War was draining resources, and ambitious domestic programs demanded more spending. The U.S. issued dollars beyond what its gold reserves could cover. Other nations noticed. France demanded gold for its dollars. Confidence waned. Gold reserves diminished. The system was under pressure. Then, in 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar became pure paper, backed not by gold but by faith, by trust, by the understanding that the world still needed American money. This was the moment the bond trick became possible. When the world had no choice but to keep buying debt, the United States realized it could rely on an internal buyer when external demand faltered. That buyer was the Federal Reserve. The central bank, established in 1913 to stabilize the economy, quietly assumed a new, essential role, purchasing Treasury debt when investors hesitated. The process is elegant in its simplicity. The U.S. Treasury issues bonds promising interest. If investors fail to buy enough, the Fed steps in, using newly created money to purchase what remains. The government is borrowing from itself, creating new dollars to fund spending and sustaining the illusion of solvency. The modern era shows the scale of this mechanism. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve purchased trillions of dollars in debt to stabilize markets. Quantitative easing became the norm. When the pandemic struck in 2020, the Fed expanded its balance sheet even further, buying over $4 trillion in government bonds in a short period. The United States was financing itself with money it effectively created, paying interest to itself, and maintaining the appearance of an active, functioning market. The illusion is seamless, invisible to most of the population. Why does this work? Because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. Nations need dollars for trade, reserves, and commodities. Demand remains high regardless of domestic policy or debt levels. Foreign countries continue to purchase US debt even as the numbers swell, reinforcing the system. The paradox is stark. The more the United States borrows, the stronger the global position of the dollar becomes. Yet, this dependence is not without limits. In recent years, foreign demand for U.S. debt has slowed. Major holders, including Japan and China, have reduced purchases. The Federal Reserve has increasingly become the dominant buyer. The system is evolving into a closed loop where the U.S. finances itself because others have stepped back. While this sustains growth and market confidence, it masks the underlying risk. Every trick works only until it no longer does. The fallout of buying one's own debt manifests in multiple ways. First, inflation becomes inevitable as more dollars chase the same amount of goods and services. Second, markets are distorted. Artificially low interest rates inflate asset prices in stocks, real estate, and corporate bonds, creating dependency on cheap money. Third, fiscal addiction sets in. Government spending is increasingly financed by debt creation, from infrastructure and defense to social programs and disaster relief. Attempts to reduce debt through taxes, cuts, or interest adjustments are politically and economically constrained. The system has become self-reinforcing. Historically, other nations have attempted similar strategies, often with catastrophic results. Weimar Germany, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, ancient Rome, and Japan in the 1990s all used debt or printing mechanisms to sustain economies beyond their natural capacity. Every case led to inflation, loss of trust in currency, political instability, and eventual economic collapse. The U.S., while wealthier and more influential, is now playing the same game on a much larger scale. The principles remain identical: excessive debt, reliance on central bank intervention, and the illusion of solvency. The scale of modern debt is staggering. The United States owes over $35 trillion and continues to add more annually. Interest payments alone exceed $1 trillion per year, more than the total defense budget. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet has reached unprecedented levels, and the percentage of government debt it owns has climbed above 25%. Projections suggest that by 2050, total debt could surpass $100 trillion. In any other country, investors would abandon the currency, causing collapse. The dollar, however, remains dominant due to global dependency, allowing this illusion to persist. The consequences of this bond trick are profound. Inflation is rising and threatening purchasing power. Market distortions are significant, with valuations in multiple asset classes disconnected from fundamentals. Debt dependency grows with each passing year, limiting options for policy and reform. The cycle cannot be stopped without causing disruption, yet continuing indefinitely increases risk. History demonstrates that no system based on self-financing debt lasts forever. Every empire that relied on such mechanisms eventually faced a reckoning. Despite the apparent stability, the U.S. bond trick operates under the fragile assumption of confidence. It depends on belief in the dollar's supremacy, in the government's ability to manage inflation, and in the Fed's capacity to intervene. Once that confidence erodes, the system faces rapid destabilization. Debt will no longer be perceived as manageable, interest rates will spike, foreign buyers will retreat, and markets will correct violently. Even the Federal Reserve's purchases will be insufficient to sustain equilibrium. The same principles that brought growth could trigger collapse. The story of the bond trick is not merely historical. It has contemporary significance. Every citizen, every investor, every policymaker interacts with this system daily without recognizing it. It shapes monetary policy, global trade, financial markets, and social programs. The bond trick underpins the United States' status as a global superpower, but it also represents a form of financial fragility unprecedented in scale and complexity. Understanding it is crucial to anticipating the economic challenges ahead. 3 core lessons emerge from this narrative. First, debt is not merely a temporary tool. In the U.S., it is the foundation of economic power. Second, the Federal Reserve functions as the hidden buyer of last resort, ensuring the system operates even when external support falters. Third, every trick has limits. The U.S. bond strategy functions effectively today, but is inherently vulnerable to shifts in confidence, foreign demand, and inflationary pressures. History demonstrates that no nation escapes the consequences of over-reliance on self-financing debt indefinitely. The bond trick illustrates the intersection of finance, power, and trust. It demonstrates that modern economies are built less on tangible resources and more on belief, perception, and the willingness of institutions to sustain promises. It is both the engine of prosperity and a potential source of catastrophic risk. Understanding the mechanics behind it allows citizens to appreciate the fragility underlying apparent stability and the hidden forces shaping global events. In conclusion, the bond trick is a profound example of financial ingenuity and risk. It enables the United States to fund massive expenditures, maintain global influence, and navigate crises with unprecedented flexibility. Yet it also creates dependencies, amplifies systemic risk, and conceals the true limits of fiscal and monetary power. Observing history, one sees that no empire survives indefinitely without structural adjustments or consequences. The United States bond strategy succeeds today because the global system supports it, but the inherent fragility remains. Those who control debt control the nation, and those who control trust control the world. The United States' ability to buy its own debt demonstrates both the power of financial institutions and the illusion of permanence. The bond trick works because people believe it works, and belief is the only currency more valuable than money itself. As history shows, illusions can endure for decades, but eventually they meet reality. Understanding this mechanism is not academic. It is vital. Every decision about policy, spending, and investment interacts with this hidden framework. Citizens, economists, and policymakers are all participants in a system that is both extraordinarily resilient and extraordinarily delicate. The bond trick exemplifies the duality of modern finance. Strength derived from perception and vulnerability arising from dependence on confidence. The lessons are clear. First, debt can be an engine of growth, but only as long as confidence persists. Second, self-financing through central bank intervention is a tool of immense power, but one that carries inherent risks. Third, history is a guide to the consequences of over-reliance on artificial mechanisms to sustain economic activity. Understanding the bond trick is essential for navigating the future of global finance, for anticipating crises before they occur, and for appreciating the invisible architecture underlying national and international economic stability. The United States has mastered the art of buying its own debt. It has created a financial engine unlike any in history. Yet every engine has limits. Every system built on belief eventually tests that belief. Observing the bond trick is not merely an exercise in curiosity. It is a study in power, trust, and the consequences of human ingenuity applied to money. It is a story that continues today, shaping the economy, markets, and lives in ways most people never see. The bond trick is both a marvel and a warning. It demonstrates the extraordinary power of a nation that can manipulate its financial instruments while maintaining global credibility. Yet it is a fragile system, dependent on trust, perception, and ongoing intervention. One day, the limits will be tested. Whether the system adapts or collapses, understanding its mechanics is essential to understanding the world. If this exploration into the bond trick has revealed the hidden architecture of American finance, subscribe to the Fiscal Archivist. Follow the trail of money, uncover the invisible forces shaping history, and learn the patterns that determine the rise and fall of nations.